Hey, what's going on, AP guys? We have chapter 32 for you today, The Politics of the 1920s, brought to you by APUSHreview.com. Alright, let's get going. We have the Republican Old Guard returns, and the president that we're going to start off with in the 1920s is Warren G. And not this Warren G, but Warren G. Harding. He was a regulator, this Warren G. Go look him up. He's old, but he's a good one. The good from his cabinet. Charles Evans Hughes becomes Secretary of State. He was a justice on the Supreme Court. We also have Andrew Mellon, who is his Secretary of Treasury. We'll talk about a little bit later. And then future President Herbert Hoover was Secretary of Commerce. Did lots of good stuff under Warren G. Couple bad things. We have Albert Fall. He is the Secretary of Interior. He is involved in a scandal. And then we also have Harry Doherty, who was the Attorney General and did not prosecute and do things that he should have done as an Attorney General. All right, the government during the 1920s, we're going to focus on their role with business. And the old laissez-faire of the 1800s was the government does not regulate the economy at all, or the government does not get involved. We're going to see a theme in the 1920s that the new laissez-faire involves the government helping businesses make profit. So it's a better relationship between the government and businesses. So this is the exact opposite of the progressive era. The 1920s sees an end to progressive legislation, including the Supreme Court, and they're going to reverse a previous decision. In Atkins versus Children's Hospital, the Supreme Court says that women no longer need to be protected by special legislation. So they overturned the previous court case, Mueller versus Oregon, which limited the amount of hours that women could work to only 10 hours a day. And one reason for this, they cited the 19th Amendment and said now women no longer need special protection. Again, the 1920s is going to be the opposite of the progressive era. Okay, so after World War I, we're going to have a couple acts that we need to know. And the first is the Ash-Cummins Transportation Act of 1920. And this encouraged private consolidation of railroads, and the Interstate Commerce Commission promised their profitability. So this is actually encouraging railroads to get together. It's the exact opposite of what the ICC should be doing. Labor unions during this time, because of the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, are going to be associated with communists. Anytime there is a strike, these laborers are going to be labeled as dangerous Reds. Danger. And then Barry Larkin, famous Red. He's my favorite Reds player of all time. Look at him. He's not dangerous, this guy. No. And union membership, as a result, is going to decline quite a bit, as much as 30% between 1920 and 1930. So again, during the 1920s, we're going to see a lot of the progressive era being undone. But we'll also establish a Veterans Bureau, which will operate hospitals and provide benefits to the disabled. Reducing militaries. Woodrow Wilson, one of the goals was to never get involved in a war again. So there are a couple treaties that hope to prevent another war. And the Five-Power Naval Treaty is where the U.S. and Britain promise not to fortify Far East possessions. So what they have, they're not going to strengthen them, and they'll basically leave it there. And this, in theory, will lead to reduced conflict. There is no restrictions on small warships, however. You can build as many small, teeny tiny ships as you want, just limit the large ones. And then one of the dumbest, in my opinion, acts ever or agreements ever agreed to was the Kellogg-Brand Pact, or the cereal. I teach my students as a cereal pact, or the Pact of Paris. And what this says is it made wars illegal except for defensive wars, but there was no mechanism to enforce it. So a country could go and invade another country, but there was no stopping them whatsoever. It's just they pledged their word. And it's really dumb, kind of like this. This poor woman. We're going to see during the 1920s that tariff rates are going to go high. So what political party generally favors high tariffs? Hopefully you remember that Republicans want to raise tariffs, and Warren G. Harding is a Republican. Oh my gosh, it's Henry Clay. Did you know that he liked high tariffs? And his American system also enjoyed high tariffs, and the Tariff of 1816, which was the first protective tariff in U.S. history. Look at guys, I could do this all day. He'll keep coming back, don't you worry. Okay, tariffs are raised to high prices to keep American products selling. We have the Fording-McCumber tariff law, which raised rates to 38.5%, very high. Harding and Coolidge, who becomes president after Harding dies, again another Republican, they both favored tariffs to help businesses. High tariffs, this is going to be a problem that the U.S. is going to realize. The higher the tariffs, the more other countries in Europe are going to retaliate with high tariffs as well, so it can work both ways. Warren G. Harding, unfortunately, is associated with scandals. In his administration, we have Colonel Charles Forbes, who stole $200 million from the government, and he was only sentenced to 2 years in jail. So he's kind of like Boss Tweed, stealing lots of money from the government. We have the Teapot Dome scandal, which is a huge black eye for Harding and his government. Basically, we have the Secretary of Interior, Fall. He transfers land to his department, and he leased this land to oil companies, and he took $100,000 in bribes. So he shouldn't have done that. Warren G. Harding actually signs off on it, and he was pretty much a famous political cartoon. We have the oil scandal. It's the teapot you can see there, and it's going right to the White House. And it's just like President Grant, another Ohio president, Harding was associated with corruption and scandal. So Grant and Harding know corruption and scandal. Now, after Harding dies, we have Silent Cal, or Calvin Coolidge. He is a Protestant, and he took a large hands-off approach to the economy, and he desired lower taxes and debts. And his Secretary of Treasury had this idea of trickle-down economics, and that was Treasury Secretary Millen. Here he is, this idea that you cut taxes for the rich, and it will stimulate the economy. This also comes to fruition in the 1980s with Ronald Reagan. It's the same idea that we'll see later on. Farmers during the 1920s are not going to experience prosperity. They are the one group that is not experiencing prosperity at all. Please know that they are hurting bad. They're losing lots of money. The U.S. government and foreign nations are purchasing less goods because the World War I is over. There's no need for as many goods anymore. After the war, the demand went down. We had the invention of something called the steel mule. This allowed for massive amounts of cultivation in less time, so faster turnover of crops. Here is a steel mule. You can produce crops faster. So what farmers decide to do is they increase their production. They want more money, so they're going to increase their production. This is a disaster because more production equals higher supply. The higher the supply, the lower the prices. Lower the prices equals sad farmers. So you may see a question about what did farmers not do to better their situation. They never, ever, ever in the 1920s reduced the amount of crops. They just kept producing more, which will cause the prices to go down. We have an act called the Capper-Volstead Act, which exempted farmers marketing cooperatives from antitrust prosecution. So just like the Clayton Antitrust Act exempted, do you remember? Hopefully you do, labor unions from antitrust prosecution, the Capper-Volstead Act was that version for farmers marketing cooperatives. In 1924, Republicans are going to nominate Silent Cal Coolidge again, and the slogan is Keep Cool and Keep Coolidge. The Democrats are going to nominate a corporate lawyer by the name of John Davis, and we're going to have a third party, the Progressive Party, by Robert La Follette. And this new progressive platform called for government ownership of railroads and relief for farmers. And Coolidge wins in an absolute landslide, just destroys everybody. La Follette only wins Wisconsin, and John Davis gets a couple states in the South. Foreign policy during the 1920s is basically isolationism, except when we're talking about Latin America. The U.S. is going to have the military in a couple countries in the Caribbean and Central America. And America goes from being a debtor prior to and during World War I to the leading creditor. So we'll see they start to lend lots of money to other countries as well. And they loan $10 billion to European countries in the 1920s. A key aspect of loaning this money is something called the Dawes Plan, which we'll talk about in just a second. Germany in the 1920s is experiencing severe hyperinflation, meaning that the value of their mark, which is basically their version of the dollar, was declining drastically. So much so that a loaf of bread cost $480 million at one point. So the Dawes Plan of 1920, not to be confused with the Dawes Severity Act. Star this, circle it, underline it, highlight it, draw some bells, whistles, arrows, fireworks, whatever you have to do to know that these two are not the same. Katy Perry, that bad boy. Make sure you know these are not the same thing. Now, keep in mind, after World War I, Germany had a whole bunch of reparations to pay. So what the U.S. does to try to help it out is it reschedules German reparation loans. So here's the idea. U.S. banks would loan money to Germany. Germany would in turn pay Britain and France reparations. Then Britain and France would take that money they got from Germany and pay back the loans to the U.S. Treasury. This is simply a circle of money. It just goes from one hand to the other in this endless circle. And for a little while it seemed to be working out, but with the stock market crash of 1929, this circle ends, and it hurts a lot of countries. It's a little confusing, but basically it's just money keeps going around and around and around, and it is not the same thing as the Dawes Severity Act. Herbert Hoover in 1928 is going to run, and the slogan will be Who but Hoover. Coolidge does not run again. There is Herbert Hoover. Democrats nominated a gentleman by the name of Alfred Smith. He is a Roman Catholic. Hoover preached something called rugged individualism, which basically meant like you work hard. You're an individual, you work really hard, and you will do well, you will go far. Here is Al Smith. And also Hoover was a self-made millionaire. And some of the anti-Smith campaign slogans were a vote for Al Smith is a vote for the Pope. So because he was Catholic, he was discriminated against. One of the first things Hoover does when he's president is creates the Federal Farm Board, and this helped farmers buy, sell, and store agricultural supplies. Remember, farmers were not prospering during the 1920s. We also have the Hawley-Smoot tariff of 1930, one of two tariffs you need to know from this chapter. This was designed to assist farmers, so it puts a huge tariff on incoming crops from other countries. This becomes the highest protective tariff in the nation's peacetime history. Take a moment and try to think to remember the previous highest peacetime tariff, the McKinley Tariff of 1890. And this essentially declares economic warfare on countries with other nations throughout the world. They, in turn, begin to jack up their tariff rates, which hurts U.S. products. So the Hawley-Smoot tariff is the highest peacetime tariff ever up until this point, and it encourages other countries what's called reciprocal tariff rates, or really high tariff rates on the United States. In 1929, we have the stock market crash, and it's caused by what do you think with panics? Over speculation. Black Tuesday, October 29th, 1929, the stock market crashes. It is disastrous. By the end of 1929, in about 2 months from then, $40 billion was lost. That is huge now. It is way bigger back in 1929. By the end of 1930, 4 million people were jobless. By 1932, 12 million. Unemployment during the Great Depression gets as high as 25%. And what Hoover discovered was it wasn't individual initiative that was broken during this time period, it was the economic system. So some causes of the Great Depression: overproduction by farmers and factories. Again, farmers just kept producing more and more. Consumption of goods decreased because there was no war, and there's a huge uneven distribution of wealth. The few rich people held a lot of money. Many poor people or not rich people held very, very little. An overexpansion of credit. Too many people were taking out loans. Remember, during the 1920s, there was this idea of buying on credit. And the Hawley-Smoot tariff also discouraged trade, which made the Depression even worse. And to make matters worse, Mother Nature was conspiring against people, and there was a drought in the Mississippi Valley. And what we'll begin to see is ragged individualists sleep under Hoover blankets in something called Hoovervilles. People are so poor they just start popping up these little shacks and these little houses all over the place. Hoover creates something called the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, and this is a government lending bank. And this assisted insurance companies, banks, and railroads, and a whole bunch of other stuff. We also have something called the Norris-LaGuardia Act. Very, very important act. And this outlawed yellow dog contracts and forbade federal courts from interfering with strikes, boycotts, etc. So the Norris-LaGuardia Act is a big boost to unions. The yellow dog contract is when you would sign a contract saying, I will not join a labor union while I work here, and if I do, you can fire me. So this is one of the few boosts for labor unions during the 1920s. We will see FDR build off of this in the 1930s. One of the worst things that happened to Hoover is something called the bonus army. We have a bunch of World War I veterans who were really hard hit during the Depression, and they were called the Bonus Expeditionary Force, and they were promised a very large bonus. They didn't receive it yet, so they descended upon D.C. in hopes of receiving their bonuses, and they camped out, they were protesting, they set up Hoovervilles and lawns in D.C. It was a huge, huge, huge rally. Hoover doesn't want them there, so he orders the army, led by a gentleman by the name of MacArthur, who we'll learn about during the Cold War and World War II, to break up the bonus army. And he's actually kind of violent with them. And you'll see pictures of people being beaten, being forcibly removed from their protests. It's just a huge, huge disaster, public relations disaster for Hoover. The bonus army eventually leaves, and this taints Hoover even more. Lastly, what we'll finish up with, beginning of World War II, we have the Japanese militarists, they attack China. So Japan is in need of natural resources, particularly oil and rubber. So they invade China and do so brutally. And you'll see it as one of two things, the rape of Nanjing or the rape of Nanking. Go back to the beginning, what pact did this violate that many countries agreed to only a few years before, when they promised not to go to war? the Kellogg Brand Pact or the Pact of Paris. Then we have the Stimson Doctrine, and the U.S. came out after Japan invaded China and said, we're not going to recognize any territory that you gained by force. They're basically telling Japan, you're bad, bad, Japan, don't do that again. It's really kind of pointless. Japan doesn't care if the U.S. recognizes their land or not. They have it. And the U.S. and other countries do not stand up to Japan. This is a sign of things to come with Hitler and a policy called appeasement, which you will become very familiar with if you're not already. And it's this idea of just giving in to the aggressor. Okay, that is it for chapter 32. I hope that helped. If you have questions, comments, concerns, ideas for videos, feel free to leave them in the comments. Please subscribe to my channel if you have not already. Tell as many people as you can about my channel. Please take a moment, post on Facebook, Twitter. I would really appreciate it every time if you watch a video, if you could just let somebody else know. And don't forget to visit APUSHreview.com where this video and many more will be there, and worksheets and handouts for the videos as well as biographies of very important people you should know for the AP test. That's it for me. Have a good day, guys. Thanks for watching.